Here is the news, read by Frank Phillips. Lee Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President Kennedy, has himself been shot. It is not clear how badly injured Oswald is. A man has been detained. The Duke of Edinburgh is now on his way to Washington for tomorrow's funeral. With him in the same plane are Sir Alec Douglas Hume and Mr. Wilson. President Kennedy's body is this evening being borne on a gun carriage from the White House to lie in state in the Capitol. C.S. Lewis, the author and former university professor, has died. The forecasters say that there will be strong winds in all parts of the country tomorrow, with rain in the west and north. And here first is a report of today's shooting in Dallas, Texas, within the last hour, from our Washington correspondent, Leonard Parkin.
The man charged with the assassination of President Kennedy has been shot. Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old accused man, was being taken through a crowd in the basement of Dallas police headquarters when a man in a brown suit and black hat pushed a pistol into his stomach and fired at point-blank range. There was pandemonium after the shot. Oswald slumped forward and clutched at his stomach, and the detectives who were hustling Oswald through the crowds of reporters and cameramen jumped onto the man who fired the shot. Oswald was rushed out of the basement to an ambulance and taken to Parkland's Hospital, the hospital where President Kennedy died. Eyewitness said the man who fired the shot leapt out of a green car, jumped over a rail, rushed up to Oswald and pushed the gun into his black sweater. The police grabbed him and disarmed him. He would never have had a chance to get away, and he didn't try. Apparently, he lives in Dallas. Oswald was being taken through the basement of the police headquarters to an armored car which was to transfer him to the county jail. The basement and nearby parked cars had been thoroughly searched by the Dallas police before Oswald was brought out. Television cameras were recording his removal on tape, and immediately after the shooting, the tape was wound back and replayed into network television across the country. I saw it. It happened in a split second before detectives, reporters, and cameramen surged in confusion round the slumped figure of Oswald and the struggling man who fired the shot. Oswald's condition is not yet known. The police have identified the assailant as Jack Ruby, the owner of 2 strip clubs in Dallas. And this is Leonard Parkin in Washington, back now to London.
But here is another late report from Leonard Parkin.
I've just heard from Dallas that Oswald was shot once under the heart, he said, at Parkland's Hospital, where he was taken, the hospital where President Kennedy died, to be in a critical condition, and he's been taken in for an emergency operation.
Commemoration services for President Kennedy have been held throughout Britain. At Westminster Abbey, every seat was taken, and people stood in the transepts and the nave. The Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, and his wife sat with the American ambassador, Mr. David Bruce, his wife and son. Also among the congregation were Mr. and Mrs. Harold Wilson, Mr. and Mrs. Joe Grimmond, and Mr. Selwyn Lloyd, the leader of the House of Commons. In his sermon, the Archdeacon of Westminster, the Venerable Edward Carpenter, said everyone felt that they had known Mr. Kennedy. He had brought a breath of fresh air into areas of human life too often a setting for the stuffy, the amateur, and the inexpert. Mr. Kennedy was not a utopian dreamer, but a supremely contemporary figure made to the measure of our modern age. He was untouched by cynicism, a man not ashamed to challenge his own generation with a high and compelling idealism. A brief silence was observed during the service, which ended with the battle hymn of the Republic, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, the Right Reverend Professor James Stewart, preached at the little church of Kames in Argyll. He said, "We have recognized in President Kennedy a man of courage, integrity, and devotion. Above all, a man with a wonderful vision of the world at peace. We lament his early departure from the international scene, but we know that his great work will follow him." Among the many services attended by American servicemen, their wives and children, were those at the Holy Loch Polaris submarine base. An hour ago, a specially chartered Boeing 707 of BOAC took off from London Airport, taking the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prime Minister and Mr. Wilson to Washington for tomorrow's funeral. The first to walk out to the plane from the VIP suite was Mr. Wilson. A few minutes later he was followed by Sir Alec Douglas Hume, his wife, and one or two members of his staff, who will be on hand during the talks the Prime Minister will have in Washington after the funeral. Then came the Duke of Edinburgh, who was wearing a dark lounge suit and a black tie. The airliner is due in Washington at 2 a.m. our time. Other airliners are flying leaders from all parts of the world to the American capital. Among them, President de Gaulle, King Baudouin of the Belgians, Queen Frederica of Greece, President Lübke of West Germany, and President Ben Bella of Algeria. In Washington, about now, a long funeral cortege is due to set out from the White House on its way to the Capitol. First will come 22 drummers beating a muffled cadence. Behind them will be the gun carriage carrying the mahogany coffin containing the body of the murdered president. 7 white horses will draw the gun carriage through the streets of Washington, and in the rear of the procession will be Mrs. Kennedy's car. At the Capitol, the coffin will be laid on a black draped catafalque, first used for the lying in state of President Lincoln 98 years ago. The body, in its closed coffin, will rest in the rotunda of the Capitol for 21 hours, and tomorrow it will again be borne through the streets to the Roman Catholic Cathedral. After a requiem mass there, President Kennedy will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, across the Potomac River from the White House. This is to be done at the wish of the family. 37 South Vietnam soldiers were killed today in an attack on a training camp near Saigon by Communist Viet Cong guerrillas. 4 American Army Special Forces men are missing, believed captured. An American lieutenant was seriously wounded. An American military spokesman said that between 200 and 300 guerrillas got through the camp defenses, a moat and 2 barbed wire fences, and, at a bugle call signal, opened the attack. 1 Viet Cong killed 21 of 30 men asleep in a hut. They put the camp radio out of action, burned down 5 buildings, and carried off arms. At least 5 Viet Cong were killed, but their total casualties are believed to be higher. C.S. Lewis, Dr. Clive Staples Lewis, former professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge, and the author of popular books on Christian faith, has died at his home at Headington, Oxford. He would have been 65 next Friday. Last month he resigned both his chair and his fellowship at Magdalen College, Cambridge, because of ill health. Besides his religious writings, of which perhaps the Screw-Tape Letters are the best known, C.S. Lewis produced works of scholarship, poems, children's books, and science fiction allegories. Before going to Cambridge in 1954, he was a tutor and a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford. His lectures and personality made a deep impression at both universities. His most recent work was as a member of the commission appointed to revise the prayer book version of the Psalms. C.S. Lewis was a widower. The American poetess, Mrs. Joy Gresham, whom he married in 1956, died 3 years ago. Thousands of teenagers who had been waiting for more than 12 hours in Liverpool to book for a Beatles show were disappointed. At one time, the queue stretched for over a mile, and the police had to seal off side streets to traffic. Ambulance men dealt with more than 100 casualties, most of them suffering from exposure to the rain. When the tickets ran out, many young girls burst into tears. More rain is forecast for most of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the western districts of Wales and England. There will be showers in central and eastern England tonight, probably becoming more widespread tomorrow. Fresh to strong winds are expected in all areas. It will again be rather mild. Now, once again, the main points of the news. Lee Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President Kennedy, has himself been shot. His condition is critical. A man has been detained. Oswald was shot under the heart. The Duke of Edinburgh is on his way now to Washington for tomorrow's funeral. With him in the same plane are Sir Alec Douglas Hume and Mr. Wilson. President Kennedy's body is this evening being borne on a gun carriage from the White House to lie in state in the Capitol. That is the end of the news. Now, here is Radio Newsreel's Sunday review of the past week's events, introduced by Ronald Fletcher.
But everyone knows what happened just after 6:30 our time on Friday. But here's the voice of a man who saw it happen, an American who was in the crowd lined up to welcome President Kennedy as he drove through the streets of Dallas. He saw the whole thing from about 15 or 20 feet away.
He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man... That's all right, sir. You go ahead, Charlie. As he was waving back, the shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat, and his wife reached up toward him, and as he was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down from the seat. Two shots. Two shots.
Did you see the man who did this?
No, sir, I did not see the man who did it. All I did was look in the man's face when he was shot there and saw that expression on his face and grab himself and slide. And the second one, whenever it went, why, I'm positive it had hit him. I hope it didn't, but I'm positive that it hit him, and he went all the way down in the car. Then they speeded up, and I didn't know what was going on, so I just grabbed the boy and fell on him in the hopes that there wasn't a maniac around.
Words of history by a nameless amateur reporter. Almost before the echoes of the shots had died away, the professional newsmen were racing to telephones to get the first news through to the world. Here in London, the Radio Newsreel team, knowing nothing of all this, were putting the finishing touches to their Friday evening programme. In Washington, the telephone rang in the BBC's office, and the tape machines began to work overtime. Minutes later, our correspondent there, Leonard Parkin, was on the line to London. And as Radio Newsreel went on the air at 7 o'clock, here is what was happening behind the scenes.
Hello, Leonard.
Hello, yes?
Yes, okay, you can go ahead then.
Right-ho. Well, so long as you realize all I've got in front of me is a pile of tape, which I'm just ripping off the printer, which you can probably hear in the background now, with a phone ringing as well, but I'll go ahead in 5 seconds from now. Hello, London. This is Leonard Parkin calling Radio Newsreel from Washington. President Kennedy and Governor John Colony of Texas were shot today from an ambush as President Kennedy's motorcade left the center of Dallas, where the president was on a speaking tour. Mrs. Kennedy, first reports say, jumped up and grabbed her husband and cried, "Oh no," and the motorcade sped on. From then, all was confusion. The police immediately fanned out over a wide area through the streets. People screamed and lay down on the ground as shots were heard. An Associated Press photographer, it's reported, a man called Altkins, said he saw blood on the president's head. There was absolute pandemonium around the scene. The Secret Service men who always accompanied the president waved the motorcade on at top speed to the hospital. But even at high speed, it took nearly 5 minutes to get the car to the ambulance entrance there. Reporters saw President Kennedy lying flat on his face on the seat of his car. Men and women were screaming. This is all we have here in Washington at this moment, and for the moment I return you to Radio Newsreel in London.
Almost within seconds, that dispatch, with the conversation edited out, was flashed into Radio Newsreel. Twice more, while the programme ran its course, Leonard Parkin kept us up with events.
Hello, London. I've just heard from Dallas that the president is still alive, but in critical condition. 2 Catholic priests have been called to the hospital where he's lying, and he's already been given blood transfusions. He was apparently shot in the head, and the governor of Texas, Governor Connolly, was shot in the chest. He's in the operating room at this moment. But apparently the emergency facilities in the room that President Kennedy was taken to are adequate to deal with the president there. Now, I'll just pause a second to have a look at a message I've just received from Dallas. Now, this says again that he's been given blood transfusions in an effort to save his life after he and the governor were shot. That's all we have from here at this moment. We'll be coming through later. Now back to London.
And finally, Radio Newsreel brought listeners the news that everyone had dreaded. It was all over. President Kennedy was dead. And so, long live the president. Back in Dallas, Texas, on the airfield, while the plane waited to take Mr. Kennedy's body back to Washington, the new man, Senator Lyndon Johnson, was sworn in.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God.
There are times in life when mind and heart stand still and everything in one cries in protest at the news. That was what Sir Alec Douglas Hume said of Friday's assassination.
This moment is the more poignant because only a few weeks ago I was walking with President Kennedy in the grounds of the White House, and he was telling me of his plans to guard and to keep the peace of the world. And as I recall his vivid presence, he lives in my mind as a man who, first of all, was a man of peace and a man with a deep religious faith, which was dedicated to healing the divisions between men. And then, as a man of physical courage, as you know, he was a casualty in the war and very often in pain. But he was a man who was determined that this curse of war should never scourge mankind again if he could do anything to arrest the dangers. And one, too, who of course had in his power and in his hand such power as had never been given before in the history of man to a mortal man. And he used it always for high purpose, and always to make the world a better place and a safer place for ordinary men and women to live in.
Here in London, Mr. Harold Wilson said,
"When I heard the news, I was addressing a large meeting, and when it was announced, all the people in the hall let out an involuntary gasp of horror, and as they stood in sympathy, in tribute to President Kennedy, one could sense that they were almost stunned by what they had heard."
Political leaders, heads of state, ordinary people all felt the same. In Moscow, Mr. Khrushchev spoke of this heinous act. In Rome, before the Pope took his seat at a conference, he said in English,
"We cannot commence our discourse without a reference to the tragic death of the President of the United States of America, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We wish to reiterate here the sentiments to which we have already given public expression of deploration of the criminal action, of admiration for the man and the statesman, of prayers for his eternal repose, for his country and for the world, which recognize in him a great leader."
Among all the voices raised in horror, anger and tribute, there was a discordant one. The voice of the man who's been charged with the president's murder, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old Texan who spent some time in Russia and who recently was chairman of an organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Here's what he himself said about that when he appeared on television 2 or 3 months ago.
"We are not at all communist controlled, regardless of the fact that I have the experience of living in Russia, regardless of the fact that we have been investigated, regardless of any of those facts. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee is an independent organization, not affiliated with any organization. Our aims and our ideals are very clear and in the best keeping with American traditions of democracy."
Within the last hour, as you heard in the news, there's been a grim postscript to the story of Lee Harvey Oswald. As he was being taken out of a building in Dallas under guard, he was shot near the heart and is now critically ill by a masterstroke of irony in the hospital where President Kennedy died. Just a few minutes ago, we recorded, by courtesy of the National Broadcasting Company of America, this description of this latest chapter of a dark few days in Dallas.
Now, whether the bullet literally hit Oswald or not, we are not absolutely positive, but there has been a gunshot. Oswald reached for his stomach, doubled up. It'll be impossible to determine whether he was hit or not. Did you see whether or not he was hit? He was hit, wasn't he?
He grabbed himself on the side and fell to the ground.
That was my
With a cry.
We were, what, 4 feet away from him?
I was 5 feet in front of him when they shot.
What is your name?
Frank Johnson.
And you're with
UPI.
He did grab his stomach. I saw him grab his stomach.
Right from the side.
Lee Oswald obviously has been shot. The witnesses around us here seem to confirm that. It happened so fast and with such suddenness that you can understand it is virtually impossible to determine the direction from which the bullet came. Dallas police say they do have a man in custody. They believe he is the man who walked up to Lee Oswald at point-blank range and fired a revolver into his stomach. Oswald grabbed at his midsection, fell to the floor. Now you can see the pandemonium that once again has broken loose.
We got a man that I believe, I didn't see it. I think it's the man.
You got him? What's he look like?
I can't give you a description now. He is known locally.
Known locally? That was the captain of the Dallas police saying the man that they are holding is known locally, a man wearing a black hat.
From London Airport a short while ago, an aircraft took off carrying the Duke of Edinburgh, Sir Alec Douglas Hume and Mr. Harold Wilson to attend tomorrow's funeral of Mr. Kennedy in Washington. Godfrey Talbot was at the airport.
The long blue and silver jetliner, the specially chartered BOAC Rolls-Royce Boeing 707, stands in the chilly darkness here at London Airport's north side. And now out from the VIP lounge doorway, though in fact he hasn't been in, he's only just got out of his motor car and walked straight to the aircraft, comes the Duke of Edinburgh. Without an overcoat, dark suit, dark tie, walking along this paved way onto the aircraft, to the foot of the steps. A few minutes ago, from that VIP lounge, we saw Mr. Harold Wilson, the leader of the opposition, walking alone to the aircraft, and then a moment later he was followed by the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, walking with Lady Douglas Hume and 1 or 2 members of the PM staff, because he's staying over in the States after the funeral. It's all been very simple, quiet and somber, the whole scene watched by only a couple of hundred people. The party seen off by the airport general manager, by the airport commandant, and by Sir Matthew Slattery, the chairman of BOAC. And now Prince Philip, having been the last to get into the aircraft, the illuminated steps are being wheeled away. The door is shut, and away they go towards the runway and to America. They are due, this specially chartered aircraft, in Washington at 2 a.m. by our London time and 9 o'clock at night, tonight, Sunday night, by American time. And that aircraft, as it goes across the Atlantic, will be flying the same air as many other aircraft, taking heads of state and political leaders of nations from capitals all over the world to the President's funeral.
And now an up-to-the-minute word from Leonard Parkin in a Washington which is still stunned.
In the White House, 2 hours before the President's body left the building for the last time, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy and members of her family attended a private mass in the room where the murdered President's body had laid since the night of his death. Thousands in the crisp morning air of Washington are watching the mile-long journey of the funeral cortege taking the late President to his lying in state. First came the 22 drummers with their muffled beat. Then the 7 grey horses drawing the caisson containing the mahogany coffin of President Kennedy. They saw towards the end of the cortege the car carrying Mrs. Kennedy, and after that, the car of the new President, Mr. Johnson. This was one sad occasion on which the President of the United States was low in the order of precedence. The site of the late President's grave in Arlington National Cemetery has now been chosen. He'll be buried at the highest point of the cemetery overlooking the Potomac River. His last resting place will be near the grave of Major L'Enfant, the man who designed this city of Washington and whose remains, many years after his death, also lay in state where President Kennedy is lying today. At the Washington National Airport and at Dulles Airport, 26 miles west of the city, guards of honor are waiting the arrival of heads of government and their representatives from all over the world. Tomorrow, the day President Johnson has declared a national day of mourning, they'll pay their final tribute to the 35th president. It's expected that after the funeral they'll meet President Johnson, but it's felt unlikely that on this occasion there'll be opportunity for political discussions of any significance between the political leaders from abroad and the new president. On this Sunday in the United States, the country has been in church and at prayer, and millions have been preparing to watch on television the journey of the cortege from the White House to the Capitol. All over the country, people have been trying to find expression for their feelings in prayer and in music. From Fort Worth in Texas, the state in which President Kennedy was assassinated, a Baptist choir was heard across the land singing the hymn which carries the tune of our own national anthem, My Country 'Tis of Thee.
To look at the news of a few days ago, before those rifle shots had changed history, is rather like looking at it through a long tunnel. At the time, though, it had its importance, and some of it still may have, so let's try to get back through the barrier of Friday. To Tuesday afternoon, for instance, which was an important occasion for the House of Commons, and especially for Sir Alec Douglas Hume. Every Tuesday and Thursday, while the Commons are sitting, a Prime Minister has to face 15 minutes of questions. It's sometimes said to be a Prime Minister's 2 most difficult quarter hours of the week. And last Tuesday, as Conrad Vosbach told us, it was Sir Alec's baptism of this particular kind of fire.
The House was full for it, full of members, full of anticipation. And at times it was very noisy, with sharp impromptu exchanges going on between Sir Alec Hume and a heckle of MPs on the opposition benches. According to the pleasurable reaction of the Conservatives, Sir Alec Hume seems to have come through with flying colours. He certainly made his points. He didn't in any obvious way get rattled. He remembered his House of Commons formulas. He bowed gracefully to Dame Irene Ward. He remembered to call Mr. Whig the honourable and gallant gentleman, all vital matters of behaviour and procedure and parliamentary manner. And he drew the loudest laughter from the Conservatives and the most obvious delight with some quite neat bits of verbal fencing. One of the ploys at question time, when, for example, a Scottish member said that he didn't trust him. The reply to him, well, I hope you will trust me, but I shan't lose very much sleep if you don't. This kind of thing, this verbal fencing, this thrust and counter-thrust and parry of words, obviously he enjoyed. He was noticeably polite to Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson asked about the responsibility of ministers answering questions in the House about security matters. And Sir Alec Hume said that he would value a private conversation with Mr. Wilson about this. But there followed the concealed barb. Because, he said, because it is quite clear there is a lot which the right honourable gentleman doesn't understand.
All that over, the House settled down again to more serious business. It heard, among other things, something of the government's new plans for dealing with land profiteers, and something of its difficulties in finding the right aircraft for the Air Force and the Navy to share. And on Wednesday evening, by the way, Radio Newsreel was first with the news again when we interrupted our programme to tell listeners that the chairman of BOAC, Sir Matthew Slattery, had resigned, and that a younger man, Sir Giles Guthrie, was taking over. The following night in the reel, the Air Minister, Mr. Julian Amery, talked to our air correspondent Reginald Turnhill, and he denied that this meant the government has lost confidence in the management of BOAC.
I think it would be wrong to say that. I don't see why a change necessarily implies a loss of confidence. You have to make changes from time to time. But of course there were these very disappointing results, a deficit of £80 million and very big problems looming ahead.
Is there no change in government policy to the extent that you've decided that it's more important that BOAC shall make a profit than be a national prestige instrument?
We've always thought that BOAC should make a profit. We think so still.
What about Sir Giles's salary? Sir Matthew, I believe, was getting £8,500.
Sir Giles is being brought in at a salary of £15,000 a year to come into the chairmanship of the corporation and to give up the work he's been doing in private, he's sacrificing over 5,000 a year.
And what did Sir Matthew Strattery himself think about it?
Well, my term of office was due to expire on the 29th of July next year. That's 1964 in any case. And when the minister told me that he had already selected my successor, it seemed to me that it would be better for the corporation, indeed better for all concerned, if I went at a mutually convenient date before that time. And so I'm actually going at the end of the year.
And what about the new man, Sir Giles Guthrie? One Labour critic said, as far as he could see, his only qualifications for that 15,000 a year were that he was a Conservative supporter and had been to Eton. We put that to Sir Giles.
Yes, I read that. Well, in fact, I did train before the war with British Airways, which was, of course, the other airline to Imperial Airways. I was on the commercial side of British Airways, and I served with them in London and Paris, also in Hamburg and Warsaw. So I think I had a reasonably good grounding. Since the war, I have, of course, spent the last almost 5 years in BEA, and with that basic experience, I think I was able to pick up a certain amount of how one runs a modern airline, and one which I may add makes a profit.
There was good news on Thursday for all those people waiting for new telephones. The Postmaster General, Mr. Reginald Bevins, said he hopes the end of the queue will be reached by the spring of 1966. All this isn't going to cost nothing, though.
Well, it certainly is by far the most ambitious plan the Post Office has ever had for the improvement and expansion of the telephone system. We envisage in the Post Office that during the next 5 years, something like 2 million people will ask for a telephone. We also believe that there will be an additional number of calls at the end of the 5-year period of the order of 5 million a day. Now, it's to meet that increasing demand both for telephones and for the use of the telephone that we plan to spend £900 million to meet that demand in every respect, to abolish the waiting list, to give quick and efficient service.
Some of those troubles they've been having recently in Iraq spilled over on Wednesday into one of those quiet, stately streets in South Kensington. Down with Nasser, down with Arif. The Iraqi students in London who staged the demonstration actually took over the Iraqi embassy for several hours, while the ambassador and his staff beat a diplomatic retreat. All but one of them, the press attaché, Hashim al-Rubai.
Well, I have stayed in the embassy because I do believe that what has been done in Iraq, I mean the late coup in Iraq, is against the will of the Iraqi people.
That dart, which somebody is said to have thrown at one of the goalkeepers during a recent match on the Everton ground, did a boomerang back into the news in midweek when we heard that the Everton club had started to put up tubular steel barriers 16 feet behind each goal to keep any future dart throwers or over-exuberant spectators at a suitable distance. They did this after they'd had 2 strong complaints from the Football Association, but the Everton chairman, Mr. John Moores, denied that hooliganism was on the upgrade at Goodison Park.
We still say that the Everton crowd are extremely well behaved. In the history of Everton, the police have never had yet to bring one case of disorderly conduct against any of our spectators. Very few people ever defy the police and get on the ground here. And as a whole, I'd say our spectators are almost better behaved than any other crowd in the country. There's no question of hooliganism at all. It's just an occasional stupid person throws a dangerous missile, which, of course, we would agree must be stopped.
In this age of the beetle and the beatnik, there's one public image that hardly seems to have changed at all. The same uniforms, the same hymns, the same tambourines, the same Salvation Army. General Kitching, who retired from the head of it on Friday, told Godfrey Talbot that he himself didn't think it had altered much.
No, I don't think it has. By and large, it's much the same. Though, of course, if one wanted to strike a vein of humour, the skirts of the women officers are a little shorter than they used to be, and the bonnet also is a little smaller. But I think the image of the Salvation Army does remain very much the same, and I think it still makes a very strong appeal, particularly to the man in the street.
At this moment of your retiring, how do you characterize the moral state of this country?
I think that it has to be admitted that now and again, of course, one does become very conscious of wrong ways of living on the part of many young people. But I would find it very hard to say that the morals of the country are worse than they were 50 years ago. I think the only difference is, of course, that now they are more pronounced, they are seen more easily, and if one may there again speak with a little sense of humour, though one would be loath to suggest it in the question of morals, I think a great deal of the evils of the present age are covered up with a good deal of eau de cologne.
But if the Salvation Army clings to tradition, Britain's new National Theatre isn't going to. The new building it's to have on the South Bank will be designed by one of the best-known architects of the modern school, Mr. Dennis Lasden, and nobody has any idea yet what will emerge. Not even the director of the theatre himself, Sir Laurence Olivier.
What people might describe as a perfect theatre nowadays is a little bit difficult to determine, as the theatre is in such a rapidly moving process of development. Where it is going, we can't be quite sure. I think we might be able to make up our minds within about 6 months to a year, together with the architect. I think what we have lacked all this time, and all of our thoughts, all we people of the theatre who have been planning various theatres, is real cooperation with an architect of extremely highly developed imagination and inspiration, and I think we've got this now in Dennis Lasden.
And what does Mr. Lasden think of the problems he has to reconcile?
There are enormous problems of traffic movement, egress and access to the site. Over and above the problem of solving opera, solving theatre, there is a problem of doing something worthy of that bend in the river. Immense architectural problems before you even get down to the technology of the theatre. I shall be surrounded by my partners and colleagues, architects with whom I work and whom I'm so pleased to be working. I can only say we shall do our best, and it will not be spared any effort.
Next door to where the new National Theatre will be, on Friday they held what must have been one of the biggest 50th birthday parties anyone's ever had. It was Benjamin Britten's, and to celebrate the half-century of the man that many people think is the composer of the century, a packed house heard a full concert version of his opera Gloriana. During one of the rehearsals, Mr. Britten, who's written a great deal of music, told Douglas Brown how he organised his average working day.
I don't work very much. I do the bulk of my work away from the paper, when travelling around, when walking, when driving cars, in trains, not in aeroplanes, which I don't enjoy so much. I actually go to the paper at a very late stage in the creation, and then I work to a set routine. Only when I'm in Albury at home, I work from as early in the morning as I can until lunchtime, then break in the afternoon for walking and considering what I have done, and then again late afternoon to early evening.
Have you had to pick out any single work of yours to be judged by posterity? Which one would it be?
Oh, I think I'm like most mothers, that the youngest child is perhaps the favorite. And I suppose War Requiem is the piece which I hope will be remembered longest. But that is not only because of the music, it is because of the message contained in it.
Who's had the greatest influence on your work and life?
The individual composer who has had the most influence would be Purcell.
Mm-hmm. And your main source of inspiration, can you define it?
Life.
Well, they do say that variety is the spice of life, so listen now to an interview our reporter Ronnie Burns had on Tuesday with a female film star, weight 10 stone, aged 2. A Great Dane, in fact, called Junior, but a Great Dane with a difference, as her owner, Mrs. Woodhouse, explained. She can open windows, help with the washing up, answer questions, and do sums.
Could she subtract 4 from 7?
Well done, thank you. What other tricks can she do?
Well, she can answer the telephone, bring me the whiskey and soda, strip the beds, collect the eggs, and now it looks like lunchtime, so she better go and ring the gong.
Well, could she do that?
Yes. Go. Come on, Judy. Ring the gong. Go on.
The world's longest pub crawl ended during the week with the publication of Egan Ronnie's Guide to 600 of the best of them in Britain. The ones with the best beer, the best food, the best atmosphere. 5 men had the job of going up and down the country sampling them. Clifford Luton asked Mr. Ronnie,
how do you judge atmosphere?
It's a very difficult thing to describe indeed. And finally, after days and days of deliberation, we came to the conclusion that the only way to pick and choose your pub for atmosphere is to say, well, now this is a place which it would be worth mentioning to a friend of mine as having been a nice pub I've been to.
Now, this job of testing pubs, hundreds of them, seems to me to be a very nice job indeed. What do you think about that?
Well, this is one point of view, but of course we think, and we found, that it's an extremely hard and exacting job. In fact, after a while it becomes a chore, involves hundreds of miles of motoring. This is incidentally why we cannot or we thought we can't have a woman on our team, because it's so fatiguing.
They started work on Wednesday in Bristol on a special hotel for weary motorists. It'll be the first of its kind in the world, the sort of sleeping equivalent of those drive-in banks and drive-in cinemas. Mr. J.D. Fraser, of the firm behind the idea, gave us this glimpse of what it'll be like.
You drive into the ground floor in the center of the building, and there is a reception desk which takes the length of 4 cars. There's a parking bay there. You collect your key, and you drive up a ramp. On your key is the number of the floor you will park on.
Which he said was becoming a part of our lives, or anyway, a part of some of our newspapers. And he said this.
It always strikes me, for example, that one of the fearful dangers of both atomic and bacteriological warfare, if ever it comes, would be that the masses, the great masses of people all over the world will have been prepared for years with horror stories about these matters, and therefore when the moment approaches, when the evening papers print scare headlines, and when radio broadcasts come from overseas saying that at any moment bacteria may be released or atomic bombs dropped, then I think you will get a panic, compared with which the exodus from Brussels and Paris during the present war will seem trivial.
The voice of the late Aldous Huxley. And now, before we end our review of the past week, up to the minute again to see if Leonard Parkin has anything more for us in Washington.
This is Leonard Parkin reporting from Washington. Oswald's condition, I've just heard, is critical. He's been taken into the operating theater for an emergency operation on his stomach. He was shot just below the heart from point-blank range. The police, who interrogated Oswald in connection with the assassination of the president, are now questioning Jack Ruby, a Dallas strip club owner, in connection with the shooting of Oswald. Just before the shot, witnesses say they heard Ruby say, "Are you the guy that shot the president?" Then the shot, and then Oswald slumped forward, clutching his stomach. At this moment, President Kennedy's body is being taken to lie in state in the Capitol. Doctors are fighting to save the man accused of his assassination in the same hospital in which he died. And this is Leonard Parkin in Washington. I return you now to Radio Newsreel in London.
And so we end our review of the week as recorded through Radio Newsreel's microphones. We'll be on the air at our usual time tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, in the Light programme.
Tomorrow afternoon, the National Broadcasting Company will be broadcasting the solemn requiem mass for the late President Kennedy, and the BBC have arranged to relay the transmission in the third network at 4:15. As well as the service, the broadcast will include descriptions of the scene before the service as mourners from all nations arrive. These will include the Duke of Edinburgh representing the Queen, the Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas-Home, and Mr. Harold Wilson, the Labour Party leader. Among others will be President de Gaulle, the West German Chancellor Professor Erhard, King Baudouin of the Belgians, and Mr. Mikoyan, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister. That's at 4:15 on the Third Network.
Ten o'clock. This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news read by Frank Phillips. Lee Oswald, the man accused of assassinating President Kennedy, was himself shot in Dallas police headquarters and died later in hospital. The local police say this means that the case of killing the president is now closed. The Duke of Edinburgh is on his way to Washington for tomorrow's funeral. With him in the same plane are Sir Alec Douglas Hume and Mr. Wilson. The President's body is now lying in state in the Capitol after being borne on a gun carriage through the streets of Washington. There is to be a national memorial service in St. Paul's next Sunday. Now, for today's shooting in Dallas, here is a report recorded a short while ago by our correspondent in Washington, Leonard Parkin.
The man accused of the assassination of President Kennedy is dead. Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old pro-Cuba sympathizer, was shot at point-blank range in the basement of Dallas police headquarters. He was being taken through a crowd to an armored car for transfer to another jail when a man pushed his way forward, rammed a pistol into Oswald's black sweater, and fired. Oswald slumped forward, clutching his stomach, as detectives jumped on the man who fired the shot. Oswald was rushed out of the basement and taken by ambulance to Parkland's Hospital, the hospital where President Kennedy died. Surgeons fought to save Oswald's life with heart massage and modern electronic equipment. But at the moment President Kennedy's body was being taken to lie in state into the United States Capitol in Washington, the man accused of shooting him died. When Oswald was shot, there was pandemonium. Eyewitnesses said the man who shot him leapt out of a green car, jumped over a rail, hurled himself towards Oswald, and said, "Are you the guy that shot Kennedy?" and pulled the trigger. Detectives grabbed him and disarmed him. The man has now been identified as Jack Ruby, who runs 2 strip clubs in Dallas, an emotional extrovert, according to the people who know him, and a man who could be kind one minute and angry the next. It's believed that Ruby changed his name from Rubenstein when he went to Dallas from Chicago. He's already well known to Dallas police because of his cabaret club activity. It's not thought that he's connected with any political organizations. Police in Dallas say that Ruby will be charged with the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who himself was accused of assassinating President Kennedy.
Ruby was later formally charged with murder. His lawyers immediately announced that they would seek a writ of habeas corpus in the Dallas District Court tomorrow. If granted, this would permit his release pending trial. Earlier, the head of the local homicide squad said the case of President Kennedy's assassination was closed by Oswald's death. But, he added, "We never quit digging for evidence." A specially chartered BOAC Boeing 707 flying the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prime Minister, and Mr. Harold Wilson to Washington for tomorrow's funeral is due there in about 4 hours' time. At London Airport, Mr. Wilson walked out alone from the VIP lounge to the plane. A moment later, Sir Alec Douglas Hume and his wife followed, and 1 or 2 members of the Prime Minister's staff, who will be on hand during his talks with American leaders after the funeral. Mr. Grimmond had taken an earlier flight. When he got to the airport, he found he had forgotten his passport, and emergency travelling papers were issued for him. Other airliners are flying leaders from all parts of the world to the American capital. Among them, President de Gaulle, King Baudouin of the Belgians, Queen Frederica of Greece, the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, President Lübke of West Germany, and President Ben Bella of Algeria. There was crisp, clear sunshine in Washington when President Kennedy's body was taken from the White House to be borne in procession to the Capitol for the lying in state. The black draped coffin was followed out by Mrs. Kennedy and her 2 children, Caroline and John. The cortege made its way 2 miles to the Capitol, passing amid hushed crowds of thousands, to the muffled beat of drums and the booming of a 21-gun salute. Tomorrow, after a funeral service in St. Matthew's Cathedral, Mr. Kennedy will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, overlooking the Potomac River. The Roman Catholic Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal Cushing, has described Mr. Kennedy as a youthful Lincoln who had made more sturdy the hopes of his nation and the people. The Archbishop, a friend of the Kennedy family for many years, was taking part in a memorial mass televised throughout the United States. In London, it is announced that a national memorial service will be held at St. Paul's Cathedral next Sunday. Today, there have been commemoration services throughout Britain. At Westminster Abbey, every seat was taken, and people stood in the transepts and the nave. Sir Alec Douglas Hume and his wife sat with the American ambassador, his wife, and son. Also in the congregation were Mr. and Mrs. Harold Wilson and Mr. and Mrs. Joe Grimmond. In his sermon, the Archdeacon of Westminster, the Venerable Edward Carpenter, described Mr. Kennedy as a supremely contemporary figure, made to the measure of our modern age. He was untouched by cynicism, a man not ashamed to challenge his own generation with a high and compelling idealism. The Football League has asked the government to help professional football. In a plan sent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the League proposes the introduction of a betting levy similar to that on horse racing, and that the Wolfenden Report on Sport should be implemented with particular reference to professional football. It also proposes that the government should assist all sports, and that the League should be represented on any board set up to provide aid. The proposals follow several meetings between MPs of all parties and League officials. The League, in a document signed by its secretary, Mr. Hardacre, says that prestige in international football has become of almost political significance. Noting that the World Cup finals will be held in England in 1966, the League says it will cost a lot of money to provide the necessary accommodation at grounds where the matches will be played. The clubs would willingly provide the money if they had it, but as it is, many clubs are kept going only because directors dig into their own pockets. C.S. Lewis, Dr. Clive Staples Lewis, former professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge, and the author of popular books on Christian faith, has died at his home at Headington, Oxford. He would have been 65 next Friday. Last month he resigned his university appointments because of ill health. Besides his religious writings, of which perhaps the Screw-Tape Letters are best known, C.S. Lewis produced works of scholarship, poems, and children's books. His most recent work was as a member of the Commission appointed to revise the prayer book version of the Psalms. The Spanish Minister of Information and Tourism, Senor Don Fraga Iribane, who arrived in London today on a week's official visit, found a demonstration awaiting him outside the Spanish embassy. It had been organized by about 300 members of the Spanish National Confederation of Labour exiled in Britain. The demonstrators were stopped by the police from getting near the embassy, but 5 of them were allowed to hand in a letter. An all-day search was carried out by police in Mansfield for 21-year-old Kathleen Heathcote, a shop assistant who has been missing since last Thursday night. A Nottinghamshire County Police Chief said that they were assuming she had been murdered. She is believed to have been attacked near a rubbish dump as she walked to her home in Princess Street, less than 100 yards away. Some of her clothing and her spectacles had been found on the dump, and today police found her gloves and a watch similar to the one she wore. Thousands of teenagers who had been waiting for more than 12 hours in Liverpool to get seats for a show by the Beatles were disappointed. At one time, the queue stretched for over a mile, and the police had to seal off side streets to traffic. Ambulance men dealt with more than 100 casualties, most of them suffering from exposure to the rain. The international cross-country race at Brussels was won by the Belgian runner Henri Clerks, who covered nearly 6 miles in just under 33 minutes. Second was Buddy Edelin, an American based in Britain, and third, Melvin Batty of Britain. Stan Eldon, who tailed the field for most of the race, finished last. Of Britain's 3 other runners, Dan Kelly finished 7th, John Farrington 11th, and Eddie Strong 18th. That is the end of the news.